Speak now, O God, through words that are ancient and words that are modern. May all you have to say find new life and new relevance in our lives as we live them in these days. In your many names we pray. Amen. This week I read an article by Reverend Chris Ferg, who is the pastor of the Covenant Christian Church in Cary, North Carolina. What he wrote both disturbed and challenged me. Although he didn't say, rather in the article, how he voted in the last presidential election, he did say that he spent the next day looking at people and wondering how they voted. And particularly looking at people who looked like him, a white man from the South. Later that day, he confessed to his wife, "I feel like a lion. White men have always been the apex predator, and we have fed our top social status by repressing people of color, women, and the LGBT community. But Jesus has ruined my appetite." Now, what really disturbed me in this article was what his wife said back to him. Her reply was, "Yes, but you still walk in the world as a lion. That is what everyone sees." As a white Southern man, I confess that I have not always been as aware of how much privilege that gives me in this world. Oh, yes, I was sometimes victimized by who I happened to love. But that was never because I was a man nor because I was white. To the rest of the world, most of the time, I still looked like a lion. October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and our own Dee Dee Bartlett brought together all of the clergy here in New Canaan to help us learn more about this issue. She is a national leader on this subject. Most of the time, on things like this, we would have just put an announcement in the bulletin, or maybe, as we did today, an insert. But as I looked at the Reformation in preparing for this sermon, I realized that this topic and the Reformation have a good bit about which they both speak. Martin Luther, who wrote our opening hymn, nailed 95 theses to the church door at Wittenberg in 1517, 501 years ago. That simple act of courage sparked protests and a reformation of the church. It was needed because in those days the church was powerful and corrupt. Now, you should know that Luther was not your typical activist. He was not someone you would expect to be a reformer, especially a reformer of an institution that defended the status quo and protected his standing as a wealthy and powerful person. His father held leases on mines all over Germany and owned refineries. He was a wealthy political leader. And so Luther's father wanted him to become a lawyer. And he was on his way to doing that. In fact, he was riding his horse back to law school when lightning nearly struck him and caused an electrifying conversion. And he got up and promised God he'd become a monk, which he did. Now, that may seem like a humble calling, but Luther went on to get his doctorate, and he was made a vicar of Saxony and was over 11 different monasteries. This biography makes it all the more surprising that he would be the one to challenge the church at its very heart. Although there are many issues which Luther raised with the church, the one that hit it where it hurt in his pocketbook was his opposition to selling indulgences. You know, indulgences were those things that people were allowed to buy, to pay for, to get them out of going to hell. When he was alive, Bill would often tell me when people were not very well behaved in church or when giving was bad, that it was my fault. He would explain that it was my fault because I was the one that told people there was no hell. And now I have nothing to threaten you with. Well, Bill's right that the threat of hell motivates almost exactly as many people as the promise of heaven. But Luther insisted that neither of those were the church's to offer, but life in all of its eternity was a gift of God's grace. So when people stopped buying indulgences, the church had to find other revenue streams. Luther was labeled a heretic and might have been arrested and burned at the stake. His own upper-class father was furious with him because he said he had wasted all the money he spent on his education. But Jesus had changed his appetite. The church gave him another chance to recant, but Luther said, "Here I stand. I can do no other." Or if he had been a woman today, he might have sung, "I can't keep silent." That courageous stand led Luther to start a movement that became the Reformation and that became our church as well. In other words, it all turned out all right, but it might not have. Luther did not know that because everyone who had done something like this before him had been either arrested or burned at the stake. As an educated, affluent, white man of privilege, Luther risked everything because he refused to surrender his principles or to remain judiciously silent. You see, that is the problem today. It is not our theology so much that needs reforming, but our morality. The church has surrendered our moral authority in the name of political expediency. We have sold our souls out of fear of offending donors or people from other political tribes. Make no mistake, our role as a church is to avoid partisan politics, but to do so without abdicating our responsibility for moral leadership. Racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, they are just as evil no matter who is in office. We who are privileged have responsibilities, and the more privileged we are, the greater our responsibility. We cannot abdicate our duty to our children and grandchildren to leave a better world than one where someone goes into a synagogue and shoots up innocent women and men, or shoots up people just because they're black while buying groceries, or sends bombs and seeking to assassinate leaders with whom they disagree. I appreciate very much Dee Bartlett's leadership in worship today, and mostly her work, locally and nationally, to make all of us more aware of the epidemic of domestic violence. This is one of the ways in which the violence we see that is so epidemic in our country comes home even to New Canaan. It is the number one issue for which the police are called in our town. Dee Dee was honored with the Voice of Courage for her work, and though I am certain she has been honored many other times in many other ways, it is that honor that I want to inspire us today. You see, you and I must be voices of courage and compassion on behalf of those who are being neglected or abused or more marginalized or discounted or discarded. In the gospel lesson, crowds of people gathered to hear Jesus, or maybe just to see him as he passed by. In the crowd that day in Jericho, there was a blind man named Bartimaeus. Now, let's not skip past this. Notice that we know his name. We don't know the name of the woman at the well. We don't know the name of the woman with an issue of blood. We don't know the name of the Syrophoenician woman. But men are often named when women are not. When Bartimaeus heard that Jesus was passing by, he began to shout for him. But notice the religious people around him in the crowd that day tried to silence him, telling him to shut up. But Bartimaeus would not be silenced. Though if he had been a woman, I wonder if it might have been different. If she might have taken their abuse and fallen silent. Or if the men in the crowd might not have intimidated her or forced her silence. That's how it has been for most of human history. And that is how it still is, far more often than we in polite company care to admit. We who have a voice have a duty to use it. Yes, it takes courage for men like Martin Luther to stand up. But the truth is, we men have been socialized our whole lives to think it is our right to speak up, to be seen and heard. We are the lions. Women and children, the poor and marginalized, particularly people of color, have been given a completely different message by society. Too often they have been led to believe that they somehow deserve the suffering they are receiving, that they have somehow done something to bring it on themselves. That is why our souls must be reformed by the Spirit so that we can have the courage to speak out with compassion and justice. In his book, Crazy Christians, Michael Curry, who was fairly recently elected the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, the first African-American presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, he tells a story about a conversation that he had with his father, who was a Baptist preacher. His father said to him, "When my siblings and I were children, my father set us down one evening to talk. We knew something was up. My father and other clergy had led local efforts for civil rights. That night, Daddy told us he might have to go to jail the next day because he was going to be part of a protest. Then he told us something I will never forget. He said, 'You must always be willing to give yourself for a higher cause. Our lives are part of something greater than ourselves.'" is the Reformation we need today. As individual followers of Jesus and as a church, we must throw off our cloak of apathy and give ourselves to a higher cause because we believe our lives are part of something greater than ourselves. Those of us with privilege, with resources, with position and power, we must have our eyes open to see what is broken in our world and to live our lives for something greater than ourselves. In May of 1994, Kevin Carter won a Pulitzer Prize for this photo. 2 months later, he committed suicide. A close friend said that after he took this picture, he went and sat down under a tree and wept and chain smoked. This image of a starving girl followed by a vulture was something he could not distance himself from. He could not unsee this suffering. My friends, seeing can be dangerous. Today, many more people are spiritually and culturally blind than physically. In our comfort, we turn a blind eye to that which makes us uncomfortable. But Bartimaeus was a man, so he thought it was his right to see. And apparently Jesus agreed with him. I think Jesus thinks we all deserve to see ourselves and our privilege and our responsibility. Seeing is a gift of opportunity. And only when we open our eyes to see can we genuinely join Bartimaeus in following Jesus.